Well, Kellan, welcome to the podcast. Really good to have you here.
Very happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Cliff.
Cool. Yeah. So, first question for everyone is always kind of the same thing, just to get to know you. So, who is Kellan White?
That's a question I think about way often than I think I thought I would. I have come to the conclusion I'm just a guy who's trying to make his mom proud, right? That like we're all just the little kid we were, right? Trying to make their mom proud, and my family has a legacy that I try to uphold. My dad was elected official. My grandfather, when he died, they utilized him as the Godfather of Black politics. He was like the sort of campaign engine behind the first African Americans elected here in the city. And my mom herself was an elected official, first Black woman elected in Prince George's County in Maryland. She left to start a family, right? So she kind of left public service to have me, to be a mother. She passed when I was 12. And I think that I have always sort of cherished the fact knowing that she was like a history maker who could have gone to be governor or senator or whatever she wanted to be. And what she wanted to be was a good mom, right? And so a lot of the times over the course of my career, I get uncomfortable somewhere. I want to change gears. I think it's because I'm not honoring that legacy, not the political one, but rather this like love and compassion to help others and to make the world a better place. And that's all I'm trying to do now. It's just how can I help people move the ball forward and make their lives better and uplift communities. And I'm sort of it's a whirlwind because at 15 I would be like I'm mayor of Philadelphia. I've moved past a lot of that stuff, and I'm really just trying to be the best person I can be and help my community.
The influence in politics is undeniable from even that short synopsis, right? Like you sort of led with that piece. What is it like growing up in a family where politics is let's say the primary profession or passion? How big of an influence did that have on you at a young age? You talked about potentially being mayor, thinking about being mayor when you're so young. Like, who thinks about that, right? Like, that's not normal. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, the Facebook came out right around, I guess, my senior year in high school, freshman year in college, somewhere around then. It must have been high school because the first Facebook group I started was like Kellan White for president, 2030, whatever, 2020, whatever I would have been when I turned 35, right? And I never actually, till you actually asked that, never thought about that. Like, oh, of course I wanted to be elected official because my dad was, right? Like, if your dad's a doctor, there's only two paths you take. Either I want to be a doctor or I definitely don't want to be a doctor. And there's like no in between. And I think growing up, I met governors and mayors and elected officials, and it wasn't weird to me, right? They were just around. As an adult, I have sort of realized sometimes I just know things because I was sitting on the floor of my living room playing Game Boy, and my dad and someone were talking about it. Like I had this like deep seated knowledge of Philadelphia politics, like someone whose grandma cooked every day can make really good pasta, right? Like it's just like ingrained in me, but as I got older, I didn't want anything to do with it, right? And I think my dad ran for mayor in 99, right? My mom passed in 97. My grandfather died in either late 99 or early 2000, right? So I had these like back to back to back losses, right? And I held a lot of resentment towards politics and Philadelphia in general for that, right? Because I've done many campaigns now, I've won some, lost some, like it, and I've talked to candidates, and it does feel like when you lose, that people will saying you're not good enough, right? And so I left Philly. I was like, I'm going to University of North Carolina. I'm not going to Penn. I'm going to go major in sports marketing. I'm going to be so far away from this life. It's going to be great. And I was kind of like Michael from The Godfather. I came home for something, right? A family event or whatever, and stayed. And it was like, I'm not going to do the family business, and did nonprofit work. And, as I'm seeing things happen, I'm like, I have to go into the family business. And I left, I was at the YMCA, left the YMCA to go work for city council. And it was like, I showed up and instantly like the light clicked on and I was like in my element and I just did the work in a way that's like, hey, we're all people, right? Let's have this conversation. Let's talk. I understand that we might not agree, but like we should still be able to talk, right? And that sort of led me through a path where I did several campaigns, kind of ending with the presidential last year. And now I'm sort of like, all right, like what's the next adventure? Because in my opinion, politics has sort of taken a turn that is not part of my ethos of trying to be the best person possible. And it's like, okay, well, how can I still contribute to the world in a positive way, but not necessarily focus on like, can I get Cliff to vote for insert my candidate, but rather, how do we create a community that uplifts each other? And I'm someone who's always believed that I have lived and worked in the intersection of politics, government, and community, right? That those three lanes cross, and that is how you help the most people. The politics you can't avoid. We elect leaders in this country, right? And so you have to play the politic in order to win an election. But something my father always told to me was a politician's job is to get the most number of people to vote for them. A government official's job is to get the most, to do what's best for the most number of people, even if they don't like it, right? And he always said there's too many elected officials who are still trying to be politicians, right? And the way I internalize that, if you're like, Kella, in my neighborhood, we have terrible roads. I could say to you, well, Cliff, we could fix those roads in 6 months. Yeah, great, do it. And then I'm like, cool, we're going to raise your taxes, right? And you're like, well, don't raise my taxes. And it's just this core memory of us going to Ocean City, Maryland, and we're driving through Ocean City, Maryland. And on one side of the road, it's like, fix the roads, vote yes on Prop 16. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. And on the other side of the road, it's like, no new taxes, vote no on Prop 16. I'm like 8. And I'm like, Mom, Dad, like, I don't understand. Like, what's happening? My dad then had to explain, well, taxes are what are used to fix the roads. So the positive side is saying, no more potholes. And you're like, yay. But then the negative side is like, whoa, 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 they want to tax you more. And so I'm now in a phase where I'm like, well, how can I focus on the community? How can I focus on uplifting that? Because the politic and the government's going to happen, but the community has the ability to push everything forward in a way that really can make or break what our government looks like and how it responds to its residents.
Well, it leads me to think, especially for my audience, let's talk about your professional career a little bit. Like, how would you describe the work that you do? I've often been told, you're one of the sharpest political strategist minds in the country, which is why, and while, he lost, fair enough. That's just the game in politics. But, Biden had personally asked for you to be a part of his campaign in Pennsylvania. And you're home based out of Philadelphia for those that didn't pick up on that. But let's just talk about, what is it that you do every day up to this point in politics? Like, how would you describe your work?
Yeah, so I have historically filled a role called political director, right? Which you can't really Google what it is because it's like a weird title. But the political director is on larger campaigns, the person who is managing the relationships with community leaders, elected officials, unions. I hate the term special interest groups, but special interest groups like for the Democrats, Planned Parenthood, Emily's List, those type of groups. And you manage those relationships. So my first time doing this was Katie McGinty's Senate race, and I had never done it before. And on the first day, I go into the office. I don't know what I'm doing, right? They're like, "Oh, Philadelphia." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, but I don't know what I'm doing." And I sat down and like first overwhelmed, right? Had like a good look cry, right? And then I'm like, "All right, we've done that. What do I do?" And I just picked up the phone and I had a list of all the county chairs, right? So in Pennsylvania, each of our 67 counties have a Republican and a Democrat who is elected by their neighbors to be the party chair, right? So I just take the list of 67 people I've never met before and I just cold called them, right? Because what clicked in my head was I'm the political director for this person that they think is great and important. So if I call and leave a voicemail, they will call me back. I end up talking to all 67 chairs, and there were some chairs who like no one's ever called me, right? Because there are counties in Pennsylvania that have a smaller population in their county than like is an Ambler, right? Like, and so they're just shocked I called. I didn't know better, right? Me in 2025 might take the list of like, yeah, I'm not calling these five chairs because it's just no Democrats there. But me in 2016 was like, why not? Um, and you have the conversations, and it's about like, well, how can we get your community out to vote? What do you need from us? What do you need to hear from us, right? And my goal was always to never actually say no, not always say yes, right? But almost in the improv sense, right? The yes and type of thing where someone would ask for something and they always ask something absolutely insane. Like, oh, can you have the president come to my neighborhood picnic? And like in your head, you're like, absolutely not.
Right.
But you're like, I think that's a great idea, but the Secret Service costs alone are not worth it. But instead, we can send Malcolm Kenyatta or someone else, right? Someone else who would do it. And then on a more local level, you're dealing with local elected officials, local ward leaders, all the way down to committee people. And I love it. I love the work of just picking up the phone and calling people. And they will, a lot of times it's complaints, right? And that's fine. But then at the end of the day, it's, well, how can we work together to advance the ball? And I believe in being as honest with people as possible. So people will call me and ask me for a bunch of money or a bunch of resources. And I would just say, no, we can't do it. Right. And here's why we can't do it. It's not a you thing. Right. But it's like, it's just, cost benefit analysis. If I give you this amount of money, but there's 1,000 of you across the Commonwealth, and I have to do that 1,000 times, and we can't afford that. Right. But this is how we can be helpful. It's how you can be helpful. And, from what I've been told, I'm still well liked among the county chairs and places that I don't really go to, in part because I've always been honest with them. And I could think of a few times that like I'd call a county chair and they would complain about a decision that I made, but automatically blame someone else because they're like, you would never do that to me. And I'm like, no, it was me. And this is why. And they're like, well, you must have been pressured. No, I wasn't pressured. Right. And you're trying to explain to them like, no, I made the decision independently. But ultimately, it's about showing the respect and showing the care, and then using the strategic mind to be like, okay, we need to get in a one-on-one race 50% plus one, right, votes to win. How do we do that? How do we leverage communities? And I've sort of graduated from that to being the campaign manager, where you're overseeing the whole thing, almost the CEO of the campaign. And then I graduated from that, in air quotes, because it's not really a graduation, but becoming what they call a senior advisor, right, which is someone who provide strategic advice to the campaign manager, and it's considered, senior staff, senior role as well. And you're there to sort of, you're not handling the budget, you're not handling the hiring, but you're there to help in your expertise navigate through what the campaign needs to do, and give the campaign manager, the CEO of the campaign, someone to talk to when they're going through the hard times and they're doubting themselves or questioning what they should do, and being that sounding board. And as I said to the manager during the last race, I'm your sword and your shield. You need me to be there and take the heat for you. I got it. You need me to go bring the heat for you. I can do that too. That's my job. You're the manager. Your job is to make sure the train does not fall through us.
Does, I think about your work that you do, and obviously you work with mostly I would assume just the Democratic Party, obviously, it's for whatever reasons that you have there, and it doesn't really matter what party you work for. Something like this question applies really to any party, and independents, Republican, Democrat, like libertarian, doesn't really matter. But the question is, what do people get wrong about those that have a career in politics and helping, individuals get elected to office? What don't they understand that is really happening behind the scenes? Because what we see at the surface level, in the media especially, there's always, and it's no, it's no secret that the media thrives on fear and uncertainty. I mean, that's just what sells things, and that's fine. But that's not what it all is. I mean, how alike are the different parties really behind the scenes?
I think there's a good chunk of the party tools, the people who work for the parties, the campaigners, the elected officials, the staff, right, who probably fall into like a little a rectangle you could draw in a spectrum, right? But I think our politic today has now been dominated by the people further out, right? And it's almost like a horseshoe, right? So in the middle, we're like all like, we disagree on some things, but we're mostly aligned, right? But as you go further out, eventually the two extremes get closer, right? And I think, like, I remember Obama, McCain, and saying to myself, well, if Barack Obama wasn't going to be the first black president of the United States, I would have considered McCain, right? I was 18 years old, right? And then McCain picked Sarah Palin, and that sort of made the decision a lot easier. Like, okay, well, now, there's no choice here, right? I remember the primary in 2000. In 2000, I was 15. No, I was 13, and I was just paying attention because, I lived and breathed this stuff, right? And I remember saying to my dad, oh, I really hope it's Bill Bradley versus John McCain, because I think either one would be a good president. And it ended up being Al Gore versus George W. Bush. And I just think about the South Park episode, like making fun of our choices then, right? And I've always believed that government has to govern from closer to center, right? But now I am recognizing that you need to push your elected officials further to the left in my politic, right? Further to the right on other people's politic, so that they govern from as far to the left as possible, right? And when I say that, I mean that ultimately, universal basic income is something I'm super passionate about and like want to see happen. That costs a lot of money. And no mayor in the United States can come in from a big city and say, we're going to give every resident in our city $1,000 a month or whatever it would be for universal basic income, right? It's just, you would go bankrupt, right? But thinking to yourself, okay, well, why is universal basic income good? Universal basic income lifts people who are in poverty above the poverty line and allows them to not have to stress about feeding their family, right? Allows them not to have 3 jobs, allows them to spend more time with family. Okay, working backwards from that, then what is the best policy we can do with the constraints of our government to help do that, right? I think what we've seen, particularly with president now, is a cult of personality of a guy who his political beliefs are sketchy at best, right? Like, I don't know if they exist. I don't think he has them, right? But he's a cult of personality. And some folks from the far right have wrapped their arms around him and made him their avatar. And so people are now going further to the right, which is causing Democrats to go further to the left. And then you have the great irony of Donald Trump saying the United States has purchased 10% of Intel, and Bernie Sanders being like, that's great. And like the Republicans are like, what is happening, right? But that's the reality is you kind of, this circle that we're all on eventually touches again, right? And I think, it's good. Younger people are much more further to the left, right? But they've gone through some things. They had COVID. Their older sibling had the financial crisis. Like, they need a world where government is helping people more because that's all they've ever seen, right? That makes sense to me. I understand why wealthier people are going further to the right, because that world from the left costs them a lot of money. And I look at everyone as sort of like, again, we're all humans, we're all people. And I think we can all come back together, but we have to stop sort of demonizing each side and really go back to having conversations about policy and how it affects people and moving forward, and also being honest, which I think one side is particularly bad at.
Do you think we're going to get there? Because you and I have had this conversation sort of offline in some of our personal dealings together. Just in terms of, it's inevitable. Like, it has to swing back into, we'll call it center, or we'll call it more moderate way of thinking about issues. Because here's the challenge, and you and I have talked about this as well. You can talk about the cult of personality with a president, but really all politics become local, because local is what really affects your life. It really does. I mean, maybe it's fun for some people. I find it incredibly disappointing, the vitriol and the polarization that especially you see on social media with the left versus the right, or anyone in between, and there's I guess a dopamine rush when you when you really start to attack each other, right? And you it's a fight or flight kind of a thing. But the reality is, I live in Pottstown. I'm just outside of Philadelphia. I care more about the borough of Pottstown and what's happening in my local politics, my local school board, because I have a 6 and a 9-year-old. I run a charity. My wife runs a business. I work for a living not far from here. So everything in our lives is local. Like 99.9% of everything we do is local. How do you get people to think more locally? We're starting to see, and we see the bleed of polarization into local politics. I don't think it's as bad. I really don't, as it is on a national level because of the cult of personality. And I think that's perfectly describes what we have right now. I actually think there's a lot more opportunity locally to do what you're talking about, which is like, we got to bring people back to the things that actually matter. I go back to time. I'm 50. I'll be 55 years old here soon, depending on when this airs. It's October of 2025. I turn 55. I remember a time, when even at the local level, even at the national level, where there were differences of opinions, but they actually worked together, and not that there wasn't some level of, back and forth and snarkyism. And so like, that's just, people being people. I have that in my job where I work today. I'm sure everyone does. And we talk about the political footprint of where we work. How do we get people to come back, to a reasonable position? To your point, you can't fix the roads if the money doesn't exist. Right. But you also can't endlessly give money to a government that wastefully spends it. And right. There's both things are actually true. Right. So how do we get there? I mean, what's your insight on that?
Well, I think the biggest, and I have a lot of friends who are elected officials and they get so mad at me when I say this, but whatever, still my friend. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest tragedy in our democracy is the lack of primaries. Right. So you get to a very hyper local level. And most of the time, you don't have an option on who you're voting for, right? So we've polarized on a national level such that a lot of people will never vote for the other party, no matter what, right? You're a Democrat, you're like, I'm never voting for a Republican, I don't care, right? You're a Republican, like, I don't care, I'm never voting for a Democrat, right? You might stay home, but you're definitely not going to cross the aisle, right? And so what ends up happening is, and we'll use Philadelphia as an example. In Philadelphia, something like 95% of our state representatives, so they're the House representatives for the state of Pennsylvania, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, they don't have a primary opponent. The Republican, there's an 85 to 15% advantage or something, Democrats Republican registration in Philadelphia, which means if you win a Democratic primary, in 95% of the districts in Philadelphia, you win the general election. There's no question about it. But we're not giving voters a choice. And when you don't give voters a choice, the elected official doesn't hone their skills, right? I'm a big sports fan. I look at like sports, right? Dirk Nowitzki loses in the finals. He goes to Europe. He gets right back in the gym, right? The next year he wins a champion. Jalen Hurts loses the Super Bowl to Kansas City, sits there, forces himself to be there as the confetti's falling, right? And that man thought about that moment every day until he was across the field from the Chiefs to win the Super Bowl, right? The loss, the challenge is what made them better. In our professional careers, whatever we do, the hardest sale that you lost or gained or, the race you lose, all of that stuff makes you better because you're like, all right, every loss has a lesson. I forget who said it. Some boxer probably, right? We'll just say Michael Scott because he stole every quote, right? But, every loss has a lesson. So if you lose, you learn. I think some of the best elected officials that I have seen locally, they had hard primaries. They had to fight and talk to people they normally didn't talk to. And I'll use as an example, Council President Kenyatta Johnson. He has evolved his position on some things because he's talked to more people. It's not flip-flopping. He literally gained more information and said, oh, I've been wrong this whole time. I'm going to change course. That is what democracy should be doing. And it's not. And then what ends up happening is the local person is in a position where they're like, well, why would I go vote if I don't have a choice and it doesn't matter, right? So voting is inconvenient, right? You have to You have to show up to a polling place at between certain hours on a work day to vote, right? Or you can do vote by mail. We don't make it easy. We don't make it. You can go anywhere for a week in Pennsylvania, right? So if I'm, someone who's living in deep poverty in Philadelphia, has three jobs. My father's lived in deep poverty. My grandfather lived in deep poverty. And maybe my grandfather voted all the time. Maybe my dad voted all the time. I'm looking back at it. I'm like, well, what did they get out of this? You want me to take off from work to go vote? No, I'm not going to do it. And I'm not going to participate. And then all of a sudden, the people who need government the most are participating the least. And then the people who they elect spend less time with them because they need to make sure the people who vote still vote for them. And you get caught in this cycle, right? Where all of a sudden we're watching the erosion of civic participation, and our cities, our towns, our states are worse off for it. Because now, if I'm an elected official and I can get away with not doing something, right, that might be uncomfortable or controversial, then I'm not going to do it. And then people end up suffering in the long run. And I think that's the challenge and what we need to figure out as a class, uh, political class, is how do we talk to the voters who are the hardest voters to reach? It is easy to reach a voter who pays attention. You can throw a commercial on MSNBC. They're going to get the ads on Instagram. They're going to know election day is coming up. They're reading the paper. It's the person who, like one of my neighbors, who had no idea the presidential was, she had zero clue. She's like, what do you mean that there's an election coming up? And I'm like, how do you not know? It's everywhere. And it's like nowhere that she is, right? She knew everything about the Diddy trial, right? And then, ultimately, I think she voted for Kamala Harris because she saw a picture of Diddy with Donald Trump, and I'll take it. I'm not going to, fight it. But how do and it's not just for elections, you do nonprofit work. It's for nonprofits. How do you find the children, the folks for Kyle's wish who aren't in the network of places that help them, and find the person who might live in North Philadelphia who would qualify, right? And no one has a real answer to that because the work is hard. You almost have to find them one by one, which anyone who works in any business is like, that's not how you scale up or be sustainable. But we've left so many people behind that we have to figure out how do we bring them back. And without radical change, we never will.
I think I want to shift gears a little bit because you had me thinking about, the world that I live in, with artificial intelligence, and it's making huge waves. I've taken a couple trips down to DC to talk to some officials at the Department of Labor and some of the Congress people that are spearheading this. And I'm kind of curious, and it is a little bit of a parallel to what you're talking about, like freeing up people's time and meeting them where they're at in order to help them understand issues, but more importantly, help them understand how do you participate in this system. Because I think there's two kinds of people out there. For the most part, there are those, to your point, that are involved because they choose, it's an interest of theirs, they choose to be, and it's so easy to meet them where they are. And others, it is not, but maybe it's because they get so disillusioned by politics. They're like, I can't tolerate it in my life. And I've actually gotten to that point a little bit too, especially now with social media and the algorithms that are on social media. Like if I go on Facebook, for God's sakes, like, if I say one thing for or against, it doesn't even matter what it is, all of a sudden I am just flooded with that. And it turns me off because that's not how I think. How big of a problem is the use of technology and its inference on what we like or don't like? It's just making all these judgments for us. And for some on the far left and on the far right, it plays into their conspiracy laden theories, right? Like, and you can choose anyone on either of those sides. But for the rest of us, and I think the majority of people do sit in the middle here, they want to see what's important, but it's so hard to participate because the technology that's being used, I think, against us is really problematic. I mean, do you talk about that in the political circles that you run in? Like, is it seen as a problem or is it seen as an advantage?
Well, I think we haven't caught up to it yet, right? So when Senator Kennedy ran for president, right? Actually, maybe it was his brother ran for president. Yeah, it was his brother. He had that famous commercial, right? That
Yeah.
everyone remembers, right? It's like, oh my God, look at this great commercial, right? We still act like that's the world we live in. Like we pour millions of dollars into TV commercials, right? I have done since 2016, like 15 campaigns, something crazy, right? I haven't seen a commercial that one of my campaigns have produced in what I call the wild in a very long time. The only time I see them are at the gym or when I used to go to bars at a bar, right? And in both those scenarios, you don't hear the sound. So you just see pictures, right? Maybe my grandma sees it when she's watching Jeopardy.
Right.
Maybe, right? But the reality is, no one's TV ratings are going down and everyone's streaming, right? And half the streaming platforms are like, yeah, you can't do political ads, right? Cool. All right. But we're still doing that. What we haven't figured out is how do you utilize technology in a way that gets to people where they are. One thing I used to love to do and would still do sometimes is using locations to do hyper targeted ads, but we would do it to mess with our opponent. So you would be like, we don't have that much money, right? So we're just going to do a hyperly targeted digital ad near our opponent's house, right? So your opponent's like on his iPad, his kid's on his iPad, and a commercial for his opponent pops up, right? So his reaction is, that is everywhere. What are we doing to counter it, right? We know it was like a
Very targeted.
surgical move. It would be like if one of Vietnam's competitors was like, let's mess with Cliff and just run ads that he sees, right? I think social media is the worst thing that ever happened to society. Well, I think social media combined with the pandemic is the worst thing that ever happened to society. You say you have a 9-year-old, right? My nephew is 16. He has zero social skills because 3 years of his life, he was in a basement playing video games, not allowed to leave the house. And he was afraid to go outside, right? And his entire existence is based off of a headset and an Xbox or PlayStation, I think it was, whatever, controller, right? And he's not really on social media, but he's like in this like gamer world, right? I know so many people on social media who they will talk crazy about me on social media, like terrible. And I'll see them in real life. And I'm like, hey, I saw your tweet. Like, do you have something you want to say to me? And like, oh, I don't know. I don't know. It's like, where have we gone? Where like, I don't care what you say about me on social media. I guess it bother me. But if you really think I'm like a bad dude, why are you hanging out with me? What are you
Right.
doing? Right. And we have this instant gratification. And you know, as a millennial, I turned 40 in November. We I live in this like gap, right, with some of Gen X where like we got technology, but we were older, right? We were in high school, right? Late middle school, high school. These kids got an iPad as soon as they were old enough to hold their head up, right? So they just know if I want something, an answer, I can just click a button. If I want ice cream, I don't have to go to the store. I can click a button. If I want whatever, I can click a button. And yet we're telling them to vote. You have to go somewhere, right? Think about American Idol when it first happened. It was like revolutionary. You didn't have to call in to vote for Kelly Clarkson. You could text. It costs you money, but you could text, right? We have to make everything as easy as possible, and that means you utilize the technology, right? Australia does this thing, automatic voter registration. You turn 18, you're registered to vote. You don't have to do anything. And then they send you a letter that says, if you don't vote, we're going to fine you $1, right? They get like 85% turnout. People go, well, I don't want to get fined $1, right? And it's just, they make it, and it's vote by mail. So they get this letter. It says, if you don't vote, you get fined a letter. You get fined $1. Here's the ballot. They vote on the ballot. They mail it back. Easy peasy, right? We're at a point with technology now, and I don't hear anyone talking about it. We should be able to figure out a way that you can vote online and it's secure. You should be
Yeah,
able
I think
to,
you can.
yeah,
And people talk about, oh, the systems could be hacked. I mean, there's the the fear and uncertainty, the FUD that plays into it. But the reality is, everything that's done through technology can be traced and audited. And I don't care who you are, where you are. Like I could run a trace on somebody right now fairly easily and get at least directionally exactly what they're doing. It's not very hard. So I don't disagree. I think we leverage technology to polarize people, but we're not leveraging it to bring them together. And I would agree with you on the pandemic. It is like we don't really understand the impact. I see it with my own charity. I lost my oldest son during the pandemic, which is where the charity work comes from. And it's one of those things that it is an indelible effect that we isolated a whole generation of people for years during the most important developmental time for them to develop some of these skills. And we are so far behind that the technology has replaced what should have been, daily human interaction. And so it is like, again, in the circles that you run, that's got to be a very alarming thing, because it was politicians that made a lot of these decisions, and there's a lot of blame to go around, and it's almost pointless now to even think about who do we hold accountable. It's probably more important at this point to think about how do we not let this happen again. Do the political leaders that you talk about, especially the local ones, do they understand the impact of this and the need to do things differently in the future?
I think they do. I will give credit to a lot of the elected officials locally. Like, they're trying to figure it out, right? Do they know exactly what to do? No. But like, at some point, our society went from being a horse-based society to a car-based society. And there was probably a few years where the roads were not really great for cars. And they're like, we got to figure this out. And it took time. Right. And I think with time, we'll get there. But like you said, it was these kids who at the most important developmental time, but it also bled into adults. The other day, I'm talking to my best friend, and he's like, "Oh, I'm on this app, blah blah blah," with my wife Lindsay, and he's like, "Oh, I never really did the apps." And then he's like, "I did this one app," and then Jared's like, "Oh yeah, you guys met on that app, right?" I'm like, "No, we met in real life," and his face was like, "Oh, you met in person?" Like, yeah, we met at a party. Like, what, right? But we've like gone to this like space where everyone's just like this all the time, right? And it's like, you don't, like, you're just walking around not looking up. And like, it used to be people bumped into you, and now I'm experiencing people not looking up but sensing you're coming and just like moving to the side. I'm like, it's like, what has happened, right? And so I think we're all trying to catch up, right? Every company, every nonprofit, every elected official is like, okay, if we're going to be a phone-based technology, right? A phone-based society where everyone's plugged into technology, right? And you need services. How do we connect you to your services through your phone? Philadelphia has this thing a lot of cities have called 311, where you can use an app to report things, right? It's slow, it's clunky, but they're trying, right? And that's what's important, right? I use it all the time. And I think what we have to figure out, and I will give credit to the Trump campaign in 2016, they figured it out. They started doing some stuff on social media that people were laughing at, but it had a legitimate effect on the election, right? And you have to start utilizing all the tools and realizing that traditional media isn't necessarily where everything is at, right? If you're not going on the right podcast, if you're not on the right Twitch stream, if you're not in the right doing the right TikToks, you're missing a large portion of our society, right? And the problem is, I'll use myself as an example, I don't do any of that stuff, right? So if you ask me for advice on how would you reach Kellan White as a campaign, I'm like, actually, it's impossible to reach me because I don't do any of this stuff. So you would have to like mail me something and I read my mail, right? Sure. But like, it's like, how do we get there? And I think that's the challenge for everyone. And that's what the beautiful thing about living in a society that innovates all the time is like, this is what we should be doing. This is what America has always done. Like, oh, we're, the light bulb, the automobile, the whatever, right? This computer, all of these things, the internet all started here, right? And our society grew and the world society grew because of it. All right, AI is here now. This technology is here now. How are we going to harness it to be a force for good rather than a force that causes harm, right? And what I've learned in life is whenever something's new, the first like couple things that come out are always terrible. Like bad guys always figure out how to manipulate it first. And then the good guys are like, oh yeah, we should make sure they can't do that anymore, right? Like no one thinks you're going to have the internet, create the internet, and people are going to use it to sell drugs, right? But like they saw the internet, the first thing that popped up was the dark web,
Yeah,
right?
right.
No one thought when they created AI that deep fakes would come out so that when you got mad at your girlfriend who broke up with you, you could create a video to embarrass her, right? Like, that's when they were talking about AI. That's not what they were talking about. They were talking about saving the world, and it got used to a tool of just like pettiness, right? So this tool can save the world if we let it, right? But if we don't put the ethical boundaries around it and really apply the same scrutiny that we apply to everything else to it, it also could just rip our society apart. And I think I am excited to hear so many younger elected officials tackling it, right? Being like, we need to talk about this because I'll tell you this: my friends who are professors in the last 3 years have gone from being like, someone used AI to write this paper, they fail, to someone use AI to write this paper, they got a C, right?
Yeah.
Because they recognize that AI is here. And the point isn't that you used AI, so you failed. It's now you only used AI. You did not use your brain. You just typed in the prompt, got an essay. Use both. We should be creating a site that integrates both and that people know they can use both and that it helps us move forward. And I think government should be the first one to do that because I'll tell you one thing, giant troves of data and getting through them when you use AI is a lot faster than I had to do it myself. And I'm going to want to do that. And we can use it for stuff like that that will actually directly impact people's lives and make this world a better place.
Yeah, I agree. And let's go back to making the world a better place because you started this conversation talking about your mom. And I'm so sorry you lost your mom at such a young age. That must have been very, very difficult for you and for everyone in your family. But as she looks down on you, and I think one of the principles that you just talked about was, are you a good person? Are you contributing back to society? What is your mom seeing in you do now as, someone who's going to turn 40 soon? And how are you contributing back? I mean, what could she be proud of?
I try to go out of my way to be a friend to people who need a friend, right? I have more coffee meetings than one should have, right? I will always try to uplift people, work with young people as their mentor, right? And really just try the best I can to work harder to help people get better opportunities for themselves and even work for myself, right? And I went back to my high school in 2022 to do the lecture they did every year that I slept through for 12 years and then got to do it myself. And my whole point was like every person out there can help somebody. As easy as you see a piece of trash on the ground, just pick it up, right? As easy as acknowledging someone suffering from homelessness, right? Like I'm not saying give them money, right? Because I don't even do that half the time. I'll give them food, right? But when they ask for money, you know what I say? Sorry, I don't have any if I don't. Like I look them in the eye and acknowledge their existence. And what I hear over and over again from them is, thank you for treating me like I'm a person, right? Like I did the overnight count in Kensington one night. So every year, every city in the United States counts the homeless people on the same day. And that's how federal money is allocated. And you count them at some crazy hour in the evening so that in theory, no one's like inside somewhere that's, what we see. So I'm out in Kensington at 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'm talking to people suffering from substance use disorder, right? And, at the time I had my own thoughts and beliefs about it. And I'm talking to people who are nurses, who were school teachers, who were lawyers, right? And you find out that their dad, this one woman, I'll never forget her, she said her dad gave her a Percocet the first time when she was 8 years old because she had a headache, right? So her addiction wasn't like, you were partying at college. Like it was literally like you didn't have a choice. And for so long, she was able to control it till she wasn't. And then she was ready to get clean, goes into rehab, right? Does the 3 days or whatever it is. She's getting ready to leave, and they say, here's a bus token. And she says, well, where am I supposed to go? They said, well, you go to the homeless shelter. And she says, the homeless shelter opens at 8 o'clock. It's noon. There's going to be no beds. They said, well, I guess you got to go at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. She said, well, where am I supposed to go in between? And they're like, I don't know what to tell you. We got to move on to the next person. So she rode the bus the entire day and to back at McPherson Square Library at 2 a.m. From 2 a.m. to 4 a.m., she's sitting there with her friends. By 4 a.m., she was using again. So I was talking to her. She said, I came back here because the only place I felt safe. And what I said to her is, this is actually society failing you,
Yeah.
right? This is society failing you because there were decisions that were made in some office somewhere where someone said, they get a 10 and that's fine and blah, blah, blah. You give them a bus token instead of recognizing the next step of the problem, right? I think it's my mission to be a good person. I think about her every time I have to make a policy decision. I think about her every time I see someone having a mental health crisis on the street, right? I think about it every time someone yells at me when I'm driving, right? I think about that we don't know the circumstances that anyone has gone through in their life, that anyone is dealing with on that day, that anyone dealt with in that moment, right? And yet we all are quick to judge them, right? When we've all had bad days. There used to be a time in my life where if you caught me on October 12th, I was in a terrible mood because that's the day my mom died, right? I didn't even consciously know it, right? But I was, I was a terror, right? To the point that one of my bosses figured it out and so to tell me to stay home. You can just work from home today, right? Because like you can't control your face, you're rolling your eyes, right? And I recognize that in me, right? And now all I do every day is just try to help the greatest number of people, and that help is literally sometimes just like, let me help you cross the street, right? Let me help you bring in your groceries. Let me clean up the block. But I do a lot now. Let me reach out to the government office you need to help you get the illegally dumped trash off your block, whatever it is. And how do we constantly move forward helping people and talking to people? Because all people want to do is be heard. They want to be acknowledged as people and they want to be respected. And that really is just having a conversation. And it takes no time out of your day and it's so easy. And that's what I just want to keep doing. And it's what I love doing. And, and then I don't want to do it. I just leave my house and I get to hang out with my dogs. And I'm happy. And I read a book.
That's right. Well, I think sort of end on this note, and I'd love to get your advice, to the folks that listen and watch this, because what I've gained from this conversation is like you've gotten to a point in your life now, approaching 40, and it's not an age thing. It's a more of a just everyone reaches this at some point. I remember when it happened to me. Just really being connected with your sense of purpose, right? And no matter what the work is that you're doing, the fact that you think about that woman, in everything you do, not because of just her particular situation, but she's lost in a system that isn't thinking about her. And that gives you a sense of direction. Like it's almost like a moral grounding to say, I'm what I'm about to do. Does that resonate with helping someone like her? Right. So that she is like, I'm giving her some agency, by thinking about her and her situation, but I'm also giving agency to everyone that's like her. Is having a sense of purpose and a grounding really important? And I'd love to hear your advice that you give to people, especially young people coming up, of what we put them through over the last, 5-6 years. Like finding a sense of purpose is what to you?
To me, it's a quote from The Wire where he says, every man's got to have a code, right? And to me, that's what your purpose is, right? I know what I will and will not work on, right? I'm not someone who believes I have to agree 100% with a candidate or with a organization I'm helping, right? But I know where the lines are for me that I'm just not going to cross, right? And I know that in my personal relationships, right? There's a lot of stuff happening in the world. There's one thing in particular that's very divisive in our society. And I know which of my friends I can talk to about, which ones I can't. And that's cool, right? Like I'm not, no judgment. But I think for me, that all comes back down to a purpose that you need to know every day when you wake up, right? This is who I am and this is what I stand for. If you go to business school, right? And you're like, I want to start a business. They're going to ask you, what's your mission? What's your purpose? Every nonprofit, every business, everything. What's your mission? What's your purpose? Well, why don't we do that for ourselves? Right. And you might never learn the answer to what your mission is. But if you know, like, this is my purpose, is to help people. My purpose is to is what you do with Kyle's Wish, whatever it is, and that becomes your passion, right? And you're doing that, you don't care what's happening around you, right? And that gives you something to strive for. And I think that's what's so hard about life, that we're told by society you strive for the title and the salary and the house and all that stuff, and then you get it and you're like, that's it. And it's like, but really what it is the work you do to help other people, right? Because we are a social creature by nature, right? And we want to help each other by nature. The times that true tragedy has struck communities, people don't turn on each other, they help each other, right? A flood happens, people help their neighbor, they don't kick their neighbor away and try to, no, they help each other. When we get stripped down to our pure survival self, it is natural for us to want to help one another. There are some people who don't, and there are terms that we use for them, and they get put away places for a very long time, right? But everyone else is like, I'm going to help people. And if you remember that your purpose in life isn't just to be the best at what you do and make the most money, but to leave the world better than when you came into it, that's so much, like, that makes life so much better. In fact, on my desk, I have a Robert Kennedy quote that says the purpose of life is to contribute in some way to make things better, right? Make things better, right? That is what I look at. And it doesn't matter how big or small. You could be a line cook at McDonald's, and you know what? You are feeding someone that day, and that's amazing, right? You can be a street sweeper. You're making someone's neighborhood cleaner, right? You could be a dog walker. You could be anything, and you are making someone's life better. And if you remember that, and every day that you go out there, right, whether you're selling technology, working on a campaign, running for office, a dog worker, a street sweeper, a waiter, and know that what I'm doing is going to better someone's life, then you're going to be successful. And you're going to leave the world a better place than when you came into it.
I think that's a great place to end things. Kellan, thank you so much for sharing your story. I appreciate your time.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
All right.